August 30th, 1945. The war was over. Yet the Pacific still stretched gray, and endless its waters, beaten flat by the wind. On the deck of a U.S. Navy transport ship, silence clung to the air, broken only by the groan of steel and the hiss of waves. The ship carried more than passengers, it carried the weight of surrender, the aftermath of a world undone. Clustered near the railings stood a group of Japanese women. Some were nurses pulled from shattered field hospitals, others clerks or civilians swept into the chaos of defeat. Their clothes hung loose, their dark hair knotted hastily, their faces pale with exhaustion. They clutched small satchels, scraps of belongings, photographs folded until the edges tore. Their eyes revealed something deeper than fatigue. A dread planted by years of propaganda that told them Americans were demons, beasts, who would strike without mercy. Yet the men guarding them were not monsters. They were boys, in pressed khaki, their rifles slung loosely, their laughter carried above the wind. They offered cigarettes, canteens of water, gestures so ordinary they became extraordinary. A nurse hesitated when a pack of Lucky Strikes was held out to her, trembling as she accepted, waiting for the cruelty that never came. The sailor simply lit the match and nodded. It was a moment that unsettled everything they thought they knew. If the enemy was courteous, even kind, then what else was false? The sea rocked the ship onward toward a land the women had only imagined as dark and arrogant, a place of skyscrapers and machines. Now they wondered, when they set foot in America, what truths and what further contradictions would they be forced to face? The nurse who had taken the cigarette still felt its paper pressed between her fingers, though the smoke had long drifted into the wind. She stood at the rail, staring out at the flat gray Pacific, unable to decide whether the simple act was a kindness or a trap. Behind her, the other women remained in a tight cluster, their shoulders hunched, their eyes darting toward the Americans, and then quickly away. The ship's engines throbbed beneath their feet, steady as a heartbeat, carrying them farther from the ruins of Japan and closer to the unknown of America. They had been told since girlhood that the enemy would laugh as he cut them down, that surrender meant shame worse than death. Mothers whispered it as warnings, school teachers drilled it into lessons, officers thundered it in speeches. Yet here aboard this steel giant they were not dragged, beaten, or mocked. They were guarded. Yes, rifles ever present, but the rifles hung loose, almost casual. The sailors walked the deck with an ease that confused the women more than cruelty ever could. It was not hatred that kept the Americans near. It was duty, a duty carried out with a strange civility. The youngest of the women, a typist barely past 20, pressed her hands into her satchel so hard her knuckles whitened. Inside was a photograph of her parents, blurred at the edges from too much handling. She wanted to cling to what she knew, to the certainty that the enemy was vile and merciless. But the enemy she had imagined never would have handed her soup without a sneer, never would have stepped aside so she could pass on the narrow stairway. The dissonance gnawed at her, each small courtesy cracking open a wider question. Night fell differently on the ocean than it did on land. There were no lanterns in distant houses, no street lamps, no temple bells to mark the hour. Only the vast swallowing dark and the stars cold above the mast. The women lay awake on thin bunks, listening to the creak of the hull and the faint laughter of the guards posted outside. They whispered to one another in low tones, voices trembling their words, carrying both fear and bewilderment. "Do they not hate us?" one asked. "They must," another replied, but her voice faltered. The nurse from Saipan closed her eyes. She remembered the faces of her fellow workers who had leapt from cliffs 2 summers ago, convinced capture meant a fate worse than death. She could still hear the thud of waves against rock, still see the blur of white uniforms vanishing into foam. Yet here she was alive. Her body unscarred, handed bread and water, as though she were simply another passenger. The contradiction tore at her chest. Days slipped into each other, measured not by calendars but by the rhythm of meals and the ringing of ship's bells. Breakfast was delivered on tin trays, bread, coarse but plentiful. Sometimes butter, sometimes canned fruit that gleamed like jewels. The women stared at the food with suspicion, waiting for the moment when the trick would reveal itself. But no trick came. Hunger gnawed louder than doubt, and soon they ate silently, swallowing the abundance with tears burning their eyes. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the revolution they caused in every gesture. One sailor whistled while he polished his boots, the tune light, almost cheerful. Another sat cross-legged near the railing, scribbling in a notebook, perhaps a letter home. The women watched secretly, astonished that the enemy wrote letters, just as their own brothers once had, scribbling names of mothers, wives, sweethearts. These small, ordinary acts unsettled them more than uniforms or rifles. Monsters did not whistle. Demons did not write love letters. One afternoon, as the sun burned orange above the horizon, a soldier leaned against the railing near where the women stood. He was barely older than they were, his face free of scars, his jaw smooth from a morning shave. He lit a cigarette and glanced sideways. For a long time, no words passed between them, only the sound of wind and the crackle of tobacco. Then, in halting English, he spoke, "Safe, you, safe." The nurse did not understand the words, but she caught the tone. It was not harsh, not mocking, but gentle, almost uncertain. She turned away quickly, her chest tight, unsettled, not by menace, but by the possibility of kindness. The voyage stretched on, and in that stretch the women began to notice what they had not dared before. The Americans laughed with each other easily, their voices carrying across the deck. They teased, argued, sang short snatches of songs none of the women recognized. They carried their rifles loosely, like tools of habit, rather than instruments of cruelty. They were tall, broad-shouldered, their uniforms neat, their boots gleaming. Compared to the men of Japan, thin from rationing, hollow-eyed from years of conflict, these Americans seemed impossibly strong. The sight of them was a wound proof of a prosperity that Japan had never known. At night, the women whispered of this difference. One said the Americans reminded her of actors she had once glimpsed in a pre-war film. Another admitted that their laughter frightened her more than silence because it made them seem so human. A third confessed that when she stood near them, she felt small, as though she were a child again. They laughed nervously at their own confessions, but beneath the laughter lay unease. If everything they had been taught was false, then what had all the suffering been for? If the enemy was not grotesque, not cruel, but simply young men who smoked and joked and polished boots, then what truths remained? Storms lashed the ship. One night, waves slamming against the hull so hard the women clutched each other in terror. The deck pitched water, spraying in sheets, the sky a rolling black. Sailors lashed ropes, shouted orders, their voices sharp but not unkind. One guard motioned the women inside, guiding them down slick steps with outstretched hands. None were struck, none were cursed. In the chaos of the storm, the Americans protected them as they protected themselves. The revelation cut deeper than the lightning splitting the horizon. When calm returned, the women emerged again. The ocean lay quiet, the stars burning cold and close. The nurse from Saipan leaned against the rail, her fingers clutching wood, her mind a storm of its own. She thought of her fiancé who had sailed to war in 1943 and never returned. He had been thin, his body weakened by shortages, even before battle claimed him. She thought of her brother who had died of hunger the year before. Then she looked at the broad backs of the Americans who hauled ropes, their muscles flexing with effortless strength. The grief twisted into envy, into disbelief, into a bitterness that tasted like ash. The days passed, and slowly fear gave way to a strange rhythm. The women began to move about the deck more freely, though always under watch. They saw the sailors play small games with coins, flipping them across the planks, laughing when one skittered too far. They saw one soldier kneel to tie his bootlace, his brow furrowed in concentration, no different from their own brothers once upon a time. The ordinariness of it all pressed heavier than cruelty ever could. The typist, the youngest, found herself staring too long one afternoon at the guard who patrolled near the cabins. He caught her gaze, and she snapped her eyes away, shame heating her cheeks. What betrayal was it to notice the sharp line of his jaw, the strange brightness of his hair in the sun? She scolded herself in whispers that night, repeating the words drilled into her. The enemy is cruel. The enemy is soulless. Yet the image of his face lingered unshaken by the chant. By the third week at sea, the women had ceased to jump at every footstep. They still feared, still clutched their satchels close, but curiosity bled through the cracks of terror. They noticed details now, the way one sailor prayed quietly, each night his head bowed, his lips moving in a rhythm foreign yet familiar. The way another carried a harmonica in his pocket and played soft notes when he thought no one was listening. These fragments of humanity gathered inside the women like forbidden treasures, both comforting and unsettling. The nurse often lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above her bunk, asking questions she had no language to answer. If the enemy was capable of courtesy, then who had lied to her? If the enemy was not a monster, then what did that make her own leaders, who demanded death before surrender? The questions burrowed like splinters, impossible to ignore. One morning, as dawn spread pale across the water, the women gathered near the bow. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of salt and oil. They leaned against the railing, their breath visible in the chill, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind them, sailors moved with the ease of routine, checking ropes, exchanging words that floated like smoke. The women huddled close, silent. It was then that one whispered the question aloud. If they are not monsters, then what are they? No one answered. The silence itself became the answer, heavy with dread and wonder. The voyage continued each day, a slow erosion of certainty. The propaganda that had once shaped their thoughts crumbled with every act of ordinary humanity. They were still prisoners, still bound by fences of steel and authority, but they were also witnesses to a truth their leaders had hidden. The enemy was not faceless, not grotesque, but unsettlingly human. And as the coastline of America drew nearer, as whispers of California and Texas passed through their lips like forbidden spells, they knew that whatever awaited on the docks would challenge them more than chains ever could. For the greatest captivity was not iron or barbed wire. It was the prison of lies carried across the sea, a prison cracking open with every step of the voyage. Dawn broke with a pale glow that spread slowly across the horizon, turning the flat gray of the Pacific into silver. For days the women had whispered about what awaited them, uncertain whether the land would reveal cruelty or indifference. Now the ship groaned beneath them, as the engine shifted, the pitch of the machinery changing in a way even the untrained could feel. The voyage was ending. The women pressed to the railings, their hearts thudding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Mist clung to the water, but through the haze they began to see shapes, cranes, warehouses, and beyond them, the faint outline of a city. America was no longer a word. It was a coastline, rising from the sea. The guards tightened their ranks as the ship neared the dock. They did not bark orders with malice, but their presence was unmistakable. Rifles slung casually, boots clanging on the steel deck, they positioned themselves along the gangways. The Japanese women huddled closer, heads, bowed hands, gripping satchels or scraps of clothing. Their fear swelled, for they had reached the place their teachers had painted as a land of arrogance, a land where enemies were humiliated and stripped of dignity. Yet what awaited them defied the grotesque pictures printed in wartime papers. Rows of American soldiers stood waiting on the pier. Their uniforms were pressed, their boots gleaming, their posture firm but not cruel. They were tall, taller than any men the women had known in Japan. Nourished on milk, beef, and abundance, these soldiers loomed like giants. The average Japanese man, slight and hollowed by years of scarcity, rarely reached such height. To stand at the rail and look down upon them was to feel diminished, not simply in body, but in the entire weight of a nation's defeat. The women glanced furtively at the soldiers' faces. The enemy was supposed to be grotesque, bestial eyes burning with cruelty. Instead, they saw clear eyes, sharp jaws, hair that gleamed in shades, unfamiliar, brown, blonde, even red. Some faces were freckled from sun, others smooth as though carved from stone. They looked not like monsters, but like men lifted from magazines or films. One woman, voice trembling, whispered to another, "They are handsome." The words felt dangerous, as if speaking them was treachery. Yet the silence of the others carried a quiet, unspoken agreement. The ship shuddered as it struck against the pier ropes, tightening gangways clanging into place. Orders barked in English, echoed across the deck. The women clutched their satchels, tighter their breaths, shallow, their hearts hammering. One by one, they were signaled to descend. Boots clanged on the metal stairs as they filed down, their eyes fixed on the planks beneath their feet. Yet despite their bowed heads, they could not resist stealing glances upward at the towering figures who lined their path. The Americans did not leer. Some stared with curiosity, others with polite detachment, but none with cruelty. Their silence was heavier than shouts would have been, for it denied the women even the certainty of hatred. One nurse dared lift her eyes as she passed, and her gaze met that of a young soldier no older than 20. For an instant, the world narrowed to his face, clean-shaven, impossibly youthful lips, parted in nervous uncertainty. Heat rose to her cheeks. Ashamed, she looked away quickly, yet the image seared into her mind, defying erasure. At the foot of the gangway, the women were gathered into rows. Trucks idled nearby, engines rumbling their metal sides, painted in dull olive. Officers moved among them, checking lists, counting softly, their voices clipped, but not harsh. One officer gestured for a woman to adjust her satchel before it slipped. His hand hovered near hers, but did not touch. Another pointed to the truck she should enter, his tone patient, almost courteous. These small acts contradicted the tales of cruelty the women had believed. Every polite gesture was a stone dropped into the deep well of their confusion. The trucks jolted forward, carrying them away from the docks and into the heart of America. The women peered through the slats, their faces pressed against cold metal, desperate for glimpses of the land that had defeated them. What they saw carved itself into memory with the sharpness of a blade. Streets stretched wide, far wider than the narrow lanes of Tokyo. Warehouses stood tall. Cranes swung lazily overhead, and neon signs glowed even in daylight. Cars rolled smoothly past engines, humming with a vigor that startled them. The chrome gleamed the tires thick as though untouched by war. In Japan, the cities had been reduced to ash. Tokyo was a wasteland of rubble. Osaka and Nagoya lay scorched, their people wandering hungry among ruins. Here, buildings stood tall, windows intact, doors unscarred. Industry hummed with life, as though the war had brushed past, but never broken it. The women felt their throats tighten. This was not the America of propaganda, arrogant and crumbling. This was a land of strength, fertile and alive. The nurse from Saipan thought of her younger brother who had withered to skin and bone before malnutrition carried him away. His wrists had been thin as twigs, his eyes dulled by hunger. She thought of her fiancé lost to the sea, whose last letter had spoken of eating weeds boiled in water. Then she looked at the broad backs of the soldiers driving the trucks, at the laughter slipping easily between them, and felt something twist inside her. It was grief, envy, and wonder mingled into one unbearable ache. Along the roadside, American civilians paused to watch the convoy. Children stood barefoot, waving with curiosity, their eyes wide. Some adults folded their arms, watching quietly, neither hostile nor welcoming. Their indifference struck the women hardest. They'd expected jeers, stones, spittle. Instead, they were treated as little more than shadows passing by. To be invisible was safer, yes, but it was also a sting. It reminded them of their powerlessness, of how small their suffering appeared against the backdrop of a country that had endured war without ruin. The trucks rolled on, leaving behind the harbor, weaving into countryside that stretched wide beneath a sky washed clean by morning light. Fields unfolded golden and green, dotted with red barns and farmhouses whose porches held rocking chairs. The women stared in silence. Fertile land stretched as far as the eye could see, unmarred by firebombs, untouched by ash. Compared to the scorched villages they had left behind, this land looked almost mythic. Some felt tears burn their eyes and turned quickly so others would not see. In the truck bed, whispers spread like smoke. The youngest clerk leaned close to the nurse, voice hushed as though confessing a crime. "They look like film stars," she murmured, eyes fixed on the broad shoulders of the driver ahead. The nurse frowned, but the younger woman's eyes shone with nervous awe. Another older woman snapped softly, "Do not speak of such things." Yet even she could not deny the thought. The convoy slowed as it approached the outskirts of the camp. Barbed wire fences rose in the distance, gates looming. The women braced themselves, expecting darkness cruelty cages. Yet as they entered, what they saw was something stranger. Wooden huts aligned neatly like barns, paths of gravel crunching under the tires, smoke rising from kitchens where the faint smell of bread drifted. Guards walked the perimeter with rifles, but their postures were more bored than brutal. The women dismounted their feet, crunching against gravel, their satchels heavy at their sides. They stared around their minds, struggling to reconcile the image. They had been told captivity in America would be degradation. Instead, they found order, cleanliness, and abundance. The contradiction deepened the wound of defeat. Inside, they were shown barracks lined with bunks and thin mattresses. Their quarters were plain but not cruel. A bell rang through the camp, sharp but not jarring. Soon, trays of food were handed out: scrambled eggs, buttered bread, bacon sizzling. The women stared, unable to believe it was truly theirs. One whispered, "This would feed a family for a week in Tokyo." Her companion nodded, eyes brimming with tears. For months, they had survived on thin gruel, on weeds boiled in water. Here, in the land of their conquerors, they were handed more than they had dared imagine. As they ate, some wept silently, ashamed that their first tears in captivity came not from cruelty, but from kindness. The taste of butter on their tongues, the warmth of bacon, the scent of fresh bread. These simple sensations were sharper than humiliation. They revealed a truth harder to bear, that the enemy had more than conquered. The enemy had thrived. By the end of the first day, the women understood that their greatest shock was not the towering soldiers who had met them at the docks. It was the land itself. America was no wasteland of arrogance. No crumbling empire stretched thin by victory. It was fertile, orderly, alive. Every building that stood tall, every loaf of bread handed freely, every smile that came without menace, drove the point deeper. Their nation had fought to the death against a vision that had never truly existed. And as night fell across the camp, as the women lay in bunks, staring at wooden beams above, one thought clawed at them with relentless force. If everything they had believed about America was false, then how much else had been a lie? The first morning in the camp began with a bell. Its chime rang across the grounds crisp, and even more like a schoolyard call than the harsh clamor of a prison. The women stirred from bunks lined in orderly rows, blinking at the pale light that filtered through small windows. For a moment, some forgot where they were. Then the crunch of boots outside reminded them. They were still captives, yet the rhythm of the place already felt different from the cages they had dreaded. They lined up, hesitantly, guided by guards who spoke quickly in English but gestured with patience. The line moved toward the mess hall, a wooden structure from which drifted the unmistakable scent of cooked food, rich, warm, almost intoxicating. Inside trays were handed to them, and what lay upon those trays drew gasps. Scrambled eggs golden and steaming, bread thick with butter, slices of bacon sizzling, their aroma sharp and inviting. Some women stared in disbelief, their fingers trembling around the metal plates. For months before capture, many had survived on little more than thin rice gruel, on weeds, boiled into bitter broth, on crumbs scavenged from ruined homes. Now, in the land of their conquerors, they were given more food in a single meal than their families had seen in weeks. One nurse whispered, "This would feed a family for a week in Tokyo." Another nodded silently, her eyes burning as she lifted the fork. Some tried to eat slowly, savoring each bite as though the food might vanish. Others wept ashamed that their first tears in captivity came not from cruelty, but from kindness. Daily life unfolded with surprising order. After meals came roll call, then tasks assigned to those willing, sweeping the yard, tending small gardens, helping in kitchens. None were forced beyond their strength. They were given plain uniforms of sturdy cloth, neither demeaning nor humiliating, only practical for work. The barracks were simple but clean, the bunks narrow yet warmer than cold ground. At night, hot water ran through pipes, steam rising in showers that stunned the women. To feel warmth flow freely across their skin after years of rationing was a revelation. One woman pressed her hand against the faucet, whispering as though to herself, "A miracle." Soap was distributed, its scent sharp and foreign. They lathered their hands, their faces, and stared in silence at the bubbles, as if such cleanliness itself was proof of another world. The Americans moved among them with a demeanor that unsettled even more than threats would have. They gave instructions, politely repeating words with gestures until understood. One guard demonstrated how to adjust the uniforms. Another pointed out where laundry was hung to dry. A soldier laughed softly when one prisoner recoiled from the sudden gush of hot water, then explained, "Plumbing. Just plumbing," his tone more amused than cruel. Another time, when a woman stumbled carrying a crate, a guard stepped forward, taking it from her with a quick, almost sheepish smile. She whispered later to her companions, "I thought he would strike me." Instead, he helped. It was not freedom they remained behind fences, their movements restricted eyes of guards always near. Yet it was not the degradation they had imagined. Cruelty did not define the camp. What defined it was something harder to grasp, a blend of abundance and restraint, as if the Americans had decided that victory was best expressed, not by punishment, but by proof of their own strength. Feeding the enemy, housing them cleanly, providing soap and showers, these were subtle demonstrations of power. They whispered, without words, "We are strong enough to be merciful." The women wrestled with this contradiction daily. Gratitude for food and warmth tangled with shame that they had once been told Americans would treat them worse than animals. Every bite of bacon, every bar of soap, every polite gesture was a blow to the certainties they carried from home. They lay awake at night, whispering into the dark. Was this kindness a trick? Would cruelty come later? Or had they been lied to from the beginning? In the yard, guards tossed a baseball between them during idle hours. The women watched, transfixed by the ease of it, the sound of the ball snapping into a glove, the laughter that followed. Their brothers once played with scraps of cloth, wound into balls swinging sticks in dusty alleys before the war swallowed them. Here the game looked effortless, unscarred by hunger or ruin. One clerk whispered, "It is like another world." She was right. The camp was less a cage than a mirror, reflecting back the stark divide between what Japan had become and what America still was. Small connections bloomed in moments so fleeting they might have been overlooked. A soldier sketched a flower on scrap paper and left it near the laundry hut. Another taught a woman a few English words, "Good morning, thank you," and laughed when she repeated them awkwardly. At first, such gestures startled the women more than blows ever could. Later, they became fragments of humanity, carried like hidden treasures. The shock of abundance never dulled. Letters arrived for the Americans, handed out in neat stacks. The guards unfolded envelopes, smiled, sometimes wiped their eyes, before tucking photographs into pockets. Family seemed near to them, present even across oceans. For the women, family existed only in fading memory. That divide felt sharper than fences. One nurse watched a soldier write steadily to someone back home, his lips moving with each word. She wondered who he wrote to: a wife, a sweetheart, a mother. She thought of the letters she would never write, the faces she would never see again, and turned away quickly, her grief biting deeper than any barbed wire. Seasons shifted, frost edging the barracks windows, snow muting the clang of gates. The women wrapped themselves in issued coats, their breath rising in pale clouds. Guards stamped their boots against the cold, their rifles slung casually, as if even winter could not shake their ease. Inside, the prisoners huddled close, speaking of husbands, lost brothers, buried children they might never see again. Yet always beneath the grief came astonishment. Why were they treated with dignity in the land of their conquerors? The answer never came, but the truth was lived each day. Each plate of food, each shower of hot water, each crate lifted by a soldier's hand was proof that the world was more complicated than they had been taught. And perhaps the harshest truth of all was not captivity itself, but the realization that the enemy in feeding and clothing them had shattered the lies upon which their suffering had been built. As weeks folded into months, the rhythm of camp life became familiar. Yet within that routine, a deeper storm brewed. Gratitude for warmth and food did not erase the weight of loss. Every tray of bacon and eggs reminded the women of families still starving in Japan, of brothers whose ribs had pressed against skin, until they vanished into graves of children left in ruins, with no bread to quiet their hunger. Gratitude turned to shame, shame to envy, envy to grief so sharp it sometimes felt unbearable. The nurse from Saipan, who once clutched the rail at sea, often lingered near the fence in the evenings. She watched soldiers toss a baseball in the fading light, their laughter carrying across the yard. The ease of the game unsettled her. To them it was pastime, but to her it was a mirror of everything her country had lost. Her fiancé had once swung a stick at a ball made of rags, his body already weakened by scarcity. He had died with hollow eyes, while these men, her captors, lived strong, sunburned, their laughter unshaken by war. Watching them, she felt admiration twisted with rage. At night in the barracks, the women whispered of these contradictions. One admitted she no longer dreamed of cruelty, but of guards, simply as men faces appearing in sleep without menace. Another confessed she no longer knew whether to hold fast to hatred or to acknowledge the kindness that had come in soap and bread. The shame of such confessions weighed heavily, yet relief glimmered beneath them. War had demanded they see the enemy as monsters. Reality forced them to see otherwise. Small details carved themselves into memory, like uninvited truths. A soldier cranked a phonograph one afternoon, and music poured out swing rhythms bright and brassy, alive, in ways the women had not heard for years. They froze startled, yet some could not help but smile. The nurse closed her eyes, letting the foreign sounds wash over her until tears blurred her vision. It was cruel, she thought, that joy could survive so easily here when it had been bombed into silence back home. But it was also undeniable. Music of all things revealed the depth of the divide. Letters remained the sharpest wound. Guards unfolded envelopes, smiled at photographs, sometimes wiped their eyes before tucking them away. Family seemed present, even across oceans. For the Japanese women, family was memory only, unreachable and fading. One evening, the nurse watched a young soldier write intently, his pencil scratching across the page, lips moving slightly with each word. She wondered who waited for him, a mother, a wife, a sweetheart. The thought struck bitterly, this man might know more joy in a single letter than her fiancé had known in his entire short life. The realization haunted her long after she turned away. With each passing season, the lies of propaganda crumbled further. They had been taught that Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of endurance. Yet the guards moved with vitality, their bodies strong, their laughter easy. They had been told Americans were cruel, but cruelty did not define their captivity. Instead, it was civility, gestures of patience, and the strange power of abundance. Truth revealed itself not in slogans, but in daily bread, hot water, and the ordinary decency of men who should have been their tormentors. The transformation was painful, for it demanded they confront not only who their enemy truly was, but also what their homeland had become. The ruins of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya lingered in memory like open wounds. To return there after tasting abundance here would be like stepping from light into ash. Yet return they must. Repatriation loomed, whispered by guards, confirmed in the quiet preparations of the camp. Soon the women would leave, the neat barracks, the hot showers, the smell of bread, and board ships bound for a land of rubble. The thought filled them with dread, not relief. Some feared that the fences of the camp had sheltered them from a harsher captivity, the captivity of hunger, ruin, and despair waiting at home. Yet even as fear grew, they carried with them something they could not deny. They had seen the enemy smile. They had been handed bread by hands that did not strike. They had listened to music that defied the silence of war. They had glimpsed humanity where they were told none existed. On the final evenings, as dusk settled purple over the camp, the women pressed their hands to the wooden barracks walls, steadying themselves against the weight of change. Hatred had once been easy, a shield against despair. Now it was complicated, tangled, with reluctant admiration, with envy, with gratitude that embarrassed them. War had demanded absolutes. Life revealed only contradictions. The nurse stood again by the fence, watching soldiers toss their baseball. The ball arced high, caught easily in a glove, laughter rising after. She realized that moment, ordinary to them, would remain extraordinary to her for the rest of her life. It was not the fences or rifles she would remember most, but the smell of bacon, the warmth of water, the brassy swing of music, the sight of men playing a game as if the world had never burned. She pressed her palm harder against the wood, whispering to herself words she had not yet dared share aloud. The enemy is human. And though the gates would soon open to carry them back to Japan's ashes, that truth would travel with them, painful, luminous, and impossible to erase. When the day of departure finally came, the women gathered their satchels and folded coats, standing once more in rows as trucks waited to return them to the harbor. The camp lay quiet behind them, its fences tall, its barracks still carrying the faint scent of bread and soap. Yet what lingered most was not the structure of captivity, but the memories etched into their minds. Laughter over a baseball game, swing music spilling from a phonograph, the warmth of hot water across tired skin, the sight of letters opened. With trembling hands, they would return to a homeland scarred by fire and hunger, to families broken and cities turned to ash. Yet within them they carried something that could not be burned away, the recognition that the enemy had treated them as human. It did not erase grief nor soften defeat, but it shattered the walls of propaganda that had once bound their thoughts. As the ships pulled away, gray hulks cutting across the Pacific, the women whispered not of monsters but of men. And in that fragile truth lay the hardest lesson of all, that war had demanded hatred, but captivity had revealed something greater, the undeniable, complicated humanity of those once called enemy.